and welcome to the third lecture in the Turing lecture series as part of the Turing 100 celebrations at Persistent. Before I talk about what we're going to what we're going to cover in today's lecture, I want to spend some time about why we are doing this. So as you may be aware, this year is Turing's centenary year. So it's about 100 years back in 1912 when Alan Turing was born. So one question which we keep getting asked is why are we doing this? Why is this important? So as you all know, Alan Turing was the father of computer science. He laid foundations in the work he did for the whole field of computer science, and we are all benefiting from it. We are using it every day. But if you look at about him himself, not very people know about him or his contributions. So this celebration is about contributions made by him and also the contributions made in the field he discovered about computer science. So we, as you all know, we are identified 12 Turing Award recipients, and we are going to cover their research or their contribution as part of this series, one every month. About today's event, so today we are going to talk about Turing Award recipients Dr. Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn. As you may be aware, these are the ones who were discovered or sort of are called the father of internet. So they discovered the TCP/IP or protocol, which is being used every day as part of internet. So that's the first session, and it's going to be covered by Venki. After that, we'll have a short tea break, and then we'll have another lecture titled Net Neutrality, the Supply and Demand Side Perspective from Dr. V. Sridhar. He's a research fellow at Saskin Communications. So also talk about today's event. It's relay telecast live at Nagpur. We have Nagpur, Hyderabad, and Goa, the three facilities in Persistent where this event is being telecast. We also have 4 colleges who are attending this remotely. This KK Wagh College in Nasik, MIT College in Aurangabad, GIT Belgaum, and KLE Belgaum. Next Turing lecture is going to be about Robin Milner, and Naveen is going to talk about it. And in the second half, we are going to have a panel discussion on should programmers learn functional programming. I think it's a very relevant panel discussion considering the topic of the lecture. Robin Milner discovered the first ML, which is the first functional programming language, or not the first functional, but the ML language which uses functional programming. So about today's talk, today's talk is going to be given, as I mentioned, by Dr. Venki. I prefer calling him Venki itself. So Venki is the CTO of Persistent Systems. Before being the CTO, he was leading the telecom business at Persistent. He himself is BTech, MTech from IIT Bombay and PhD, all in computer science. Before joining Persistent Systems, he was at Lucent Technologies, where he was part of the CTO office, and before that he was a researcher at Bell Labs. We also have Dr. V. Sridhar, but I will cover his introduction before his talk. Okay, thank you very much. Over to you, Venki.
Before I start, let me just talk a little bit about how we are going to organize this. So since we have a lot of remote locations participating, what we will do is they are all connected on the phone bridge. We are going to mute all the phone bridges so that there is very little disturbance here to all the listeners. But during the course of the presentation, I will take a pause, intermediate pauses, and open up the bridges for questions. So if people have any questions at that point in time, please feel free to ask. People who are here in Bhagirath, of course, you can please raise your hand at any point in time and feel free to ask questions. I will repeat the question so that the remote listeners can also understand what the question was. Okay, so that brief introduction, let me get started. So today I'll be covering the work of Dr. Vint Cerf and Dr. Bob Kahn, who are responsible for developing the TCP/IP protocol as we know it, and the packet switching network in general. And their contribution has really led to the whole growth of the internet. So we'll talk about what their seminal work was focused on, and then talk about the impact of their work. The way I have structured this is, of course, talk a little bit about these gentlemen themselves, their personal what they have done throughout their career, a little bit of their contribution. Then turn on the focus to basically the history of the internet, how it all started, spend some time on how the whole thing grew, and then spend a little bit time at the end of the talk on what the future direction is. And again, like I said, feel free to interrupt and ask questions. I do want it to be a fairly interactive session. Before I start, I also want to acknowledge the material that I put together here. Obviously, a lot of it is available on the internet. I've taken many of the slides with permission where appropriate, and where they made it available as part of made it available for others to use. I have used the slides with appropriate citations to their work. So a quick thing for Dr. Vinton Cerf, as I've been talking about, he's widely known as the father of the internet. And he has had a very, very illustrious career in his, during the span of last 40, 45 years. When he started out his career, he did his PhD from Stanford, worked as an assistant professor there, and then he moved on to work at the DARPA. This is the Defense Advanced Research Project. And that's when he really worked on the whole concept of packet switching networks, and that led to the growth of the development of the internet, and then the growth as well. Subsequent to working at DARPA, he spent a lot of time as a senior VP at MCI WorldCom, which is a telecommunications operator in the US. And he was driving a lot of new service offerings, especially around convergence of the network, that is providing voice and data on a unified network platform. And then he has now part of Google as a chief internet evangelist, driving some of the thought leadership that Google is well known for. And most recently, in this year, in June, he was elected as the president of ACM. In terms of awards and recognition that he has received, obviously, he is in 2004, he was the recipient of the ACM Turing Award, which is one of the most prestigious awards that we can think of in the field of computer science. And he has also been a recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom in the US, as well as recently got inducted into the Internet Hall of Fame. One very unique coincidence is that he shares his birthday with the birthday of Alan Turing. Of course, I don't know if that foretells, where people, I'm sure there are many people who share his birthday, but not everyone may not be a Turing Award recipient, but definitely that's a good omen for him. The other gentleman who was a co-author and collaborator with Dr. Vinton Cerf was Bob Kahn. Again, he spent a lot of time working at the AT&T Bell Laboratories, where he did research around the packet switching network. Then he was a professor at MIT. Then when he was at this company called BBN, that's when he really started working on collaborating with researchers around the US, especially with DARPA and other agencies, to build this packet switching infrastructure. And then he got associated with DARPA and worked with Vint Cerf to develop this whole infrastructure. Subsequent to his work at DARPA, he is now the president and CEO of a corporate, of a non-profit organization called CNRI, which funds a lot of innovative research in various areas. Again, been an ACM Turing Award recipient in the year 2004, won the National Medal of Technology, Presidential Medal of Freedom, and recently inducted into the Internet Hall of Fame. So with that brief introduction to the gentleman about whose work I'll be really focusing today's presentation on, I'll be talking about, the internet, if you see, has been around for about 40 years. Late 69, 70s when it really got, the birth of the internet happened. And the phases can be kind of divided into two main sections, the first 20 years and the subsequent 20 years in the whole 40-year history. The first 20 years, what we call as Internet 1.0, of course, that's just a nomenclature I'm using here, borrowed from Professor Raj Jain's way of describing this, was the time when it was a community of the defense academic community really getting together to form this inter-network, okay, to help them to in their research work. So it was all a very non-commercial kind of a structure, and used only by the the tech-savvy guys. Okay. So the first 20 years happened that way. The most popular applications at that point in time were email, FTP, Telnet, and so on. Usenet was the other key application. So beyond that, there wasn't a whole lot of use happening. The second phase, which is the early to mid 90s, is when the real growth of the internet happened. Some of the key events that led to that growth was that internet moved from being a for academics kind of use to more of a commercial use, where regular consumers could start getting access to the internet, and that's when the real growth really happened. That also led to levels of ownership, in the sense that now the telecom operators started getting into it, started providing the infrastructure, and the moment they offered the infrastructure, they wanted to make commercial use of it. They wanted to monetize the whole service and so on, and that's when the whole multi-ownership kind of thing started happening. And with multi-ownership, obviously, there's a level of distrust. Academicians typically trust each other, but companies don't. Especially competing companies don't trust each other. So there's a lot of distrust, and security became a key issue there. And of course, the other key thing is that the whole World Wide Web, Tim Berners-Lee kind of put out the www protocol, the HTTP protocol, and then that led to the birth of the World Wide Web, and then rest is, as they say, rest is history. Then of course we'll talk a little bit about the 3.0, which is the technologies that will kind of drive the internet for the coming 20 years, let's say. So what was the problem that really Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn was trying to solve? Prior to this whole, prior to the 1970s, there were the concept of packet switch networks are around, but they were all restricted to small communities. So there was this whole ARPANET, which was used by the Advanced Research Projects Association, and they were just looking at it as only people who were part of this ARPANET could collaborate with each other. There was a network called Aloha Networks, which was again a small research community working on specific network protocols, and they could collaborate on the Aloha Net. Then there was a network called Cyclades and others. So there were all these pockets of networks, but among themselves, they really couldn't talk to each other. And when DARPA kind of came in and said, we have all these pockets of research happening, but people are not really talking to each other, he said, okay, fine, let's all connect them together. And that's when Bob Kahn was chartered with setting up or building the infrastructure to connect these entities together. So he and Vint Cerf started collaborating on this activity as part of DARPA, and they came up with a very simple objective. They said that if you have to connect this, they wanted to have a very, very simplistic interface, very reliable interface, but they didn't want it to do a whole lot of things. All they said was, let this interface deal primarily with passing data back and forth and doing any kind of translation that is needed, because each of these networks talk their own protocols. Okay? There was no one common protocol that was common across these pockets of networks. So what they defined was an entity called as a network layer gateway that totally has now evolved into what we know as IP routers. So they defined this entity called network layer gateways and said these network layer gateways will sit in between pockets of these networks and connect one or more of these networks together. Okay? And they were just doing the function of a gateway, which is getting packets from one network, doing the appropriate translation to suit the format of the destination to which the packet was intended, and then push it along to the next network from where the packet would proceed ahead. Okay? So the other key things that they started when they started working was that they wanted this whole solution that they put together to be non-proprietary. They said that there is no role for anybody, any institution or any organization to have complete control of this entity. So they wanted whatever they did to be standardized and non-patented, open for anyone to use, adopt, expand, change, modify, whatever it is. So a lot of these, what we today know as the open source kind of philosophy was there. That was the mindset with which they really approached this problem. And really, it's really a very creditable to these two gentlemen that they thought about the whole problem in a very, very friendly, collaborative manner, and that is what really led to the whole growth of the internet. Okay? They wanted to obviously, each of these networks had their own set of addressings, own set of protocols, so they defined what is called as a universal addressing scheme to identify end hosts that belong to this whole composite network. Composite network is all these pockets of network tied together by the network layer gateways. Okay? And they wanted to focus on a packet switching kind of a technology because that was the most of these pockets of network were anyway doing packet switching. So they said, okay, let's start slicing the information that needs to go as packets and then transport them from one host to another via this composite internetwork. That is the terminology that they used. Okay? All this was kind of presented in a very seminal paper in 1974, and this was the basis of what we today know as the internet. Okay? And because it was going on an, various different kinds of networks, they could not really make any assumptions on what service that network could offer. Okay? The network could split the packets, it could route the packets in any different way, and so on and so forth. So the packets could get misaligned or reordered or reach the destination in a completely different order than what it was sent out as. Okay? And that they said was perfectly fine. Said as long as there is a way in which the packet, when it reaches the destination, it can be resequenced and brought into the same original sequence, they didn't have to worry about the networking infrastructure. So that was one, again, a very, very fundamental principle that they adopted, saying that I will not depend on the network to do anything beyond ensuring that the packet that I send reaches the destination. Then they defined this whole concept of a port, which is, they said that, okay, ultimately when there are two hosts that are talking to each other, it is processes on each of these hosts that are talking. So you may have a client here, email server, or an FTP client, FTP server, whatever it is. So you have two entities that are talking to each other, and they need to kind of identify, these processes need to know what that they are going to, they have to expect a packet to reach them. Okay? So for the end host to know which process to really forward that packet to, they defined the concept of a process header, which today has now evolved to what is called as a TCP port, TCP or UDP port. Okay? So I'm just using the same terminology that was there in the paper and just trying to draw the analogy here. And because they really did not know that, whether the network would really provide a reliable service, the packets may get lost and so on, so they had mechanism for retransmission of the packet after an appropriate time interval. And the moment you retransmit, you also have to take care of duplicates, because some packets may get delayed, and then the same packet may get retransmitted and reach the destination. You have to have mechanisms to address duplicates. So they had the mechanisms to define that. They wanted to make sure that no host would pump packets and flood the network, because bandwidth was a precious commodity. It was not available in abundance, not like today. So they had to make sure that whatever bandwidth was available was not hogged by one or specific applications. So they put mechanisms to do some level of flow control. Okay? And then they defined this whole concept of a connection, which is actually an association of between the two processes, and the processes are only at the end host. So there is a source and a destination. These processes run on the source and the destination. The network, underlying network, has no idea about what this application is all about. Okay? So the network was completely agnostic to the application. All it did was transport the packets from one end to the other. Okay? I'm saying this again and again because it's also set the stage for the next session on net neutrality, on should the network see the packets or not. So we'll hear more from that in the next session. So the moment you have to have an association, you have to have a mechanism to set up the association and tear it down at the end of the association. So they had mechanisms to in place for that as well. So these were the main contributions that came out from that paper. Based on this paper, then in 74 the paper was published. Then they started working on putting together an architecture that kind of implements all the thoughts that came out in that paper, with of course suitable modifications as needed. Okay? So they defined, as per the OSI 7-layer architecture, they defined similar to that. They defined a 4-layer architecture, starting with a physical layer, a data link layer, and then the two main layers, which is the network layer and the transport layer, which was part of the contribution that came from the 1974 paper. And the key point to note here is that the network layer has physical requirement in every piece of the network. There are the middle intermediate routers, or the gateways as they called it, and then the TCP layer or the transport layer and above had only an association at the end host. There was no state that was maintained in the network. So let's talk a little bit about the network layer. I'm sure most of you know this, but I thought it's good to just re-emphasize some of the key points that happen. So IP, the Internet Protocol, was defined as the protocol at the network layer, the third layer. It was obviously a packet switched datagram kind of an infrastructure, and it glued the higher layers and the lower layers together. Okay, so the Internet Protocol was the gateway that glued multiple technologies together. Okay, so that's why you have the thin waist that everything runs on IP. Underlying that, you could have a satellite network, you could have Ethernet, whatever. Above that, you could have multiple protocols like TCP, UDP, or SCTP, or whatever. You could have various kinds of applications, but everyone rode on that IP as the network layer protocol. Okay, and key thing again, just to reiterate, it is a stateless architecture, and no flow state was maintained at the network layer. So what was the key thought process when they defined the IP was that the network has to be a very, very simplistic infrastructure, doesn't do a whole lot. All it does is basically route the packets. Okay, and that was the one that really led to its robustness and scalability, because you have a very simple entity that is sitting there, listening to one packet, translating it, and pushing it out. That's pretty much it. Because of this, the network does not really guarantee anything beyond best effort. It does not guarantee that the packets will reach in the same order that you have sent. It does not guarantee that the packets will reach at all. I mean, the packets could get dropped. It is connectionless, so every packet could take any route as possible. It could reach in order, out of order, whatever. And it was hop by hop, in the sense that one gateway would just push it to the next gateway would push it to the next, and so on and so forth. There was no end-to-end path that was set up, okay, at the network layer. And it is application agnostic, so it did not really know whether you are pushing a voice traffic, a video traffic, or a file, or an image, or a picture, whatever it is. The network had absolutely no clue. Okay, and the philosophy was that dumb network, intelligent endpoint. So whatever work, extra work had to be done in terms of reordering and all that had to happen at the end host at the higher layers. So the dumb network philosophy was very, very critical. So all it did was three things: addressing, which is finding out where the end hosts are. It did forwarding, which is when a packet came in, figured out where to send the packet forward. And routing. Routing is the protocol that is required to figure out where are all the hosts really sitting in. How do I really route? Okay, so creating of the routing table or the forwarding table. Okay, and the end system kind of take care of all the other things like resequencing of packets, error control, congestion control, flow control. All that was the higher end systems, which was at the end host. So the advantage of this was that you could really, pretty much any application could ride on top of IP without too much of an issue. So this is what a typical packet switching happens. You send packets 1, 2, and 3 in this example. Packet could get split into smaller pieces. Each packet could take a different route, could reach the destination at a different in different orders, but eventually when it reaches the end host, it gets resequenced in the same order in which it was sent. The reason I am bringing that up is the prevailing network at that point in time was the telephone network, which had a completely different philosophy called as a circuit switching network technology. What that meant was, before you really set up a voice call, you have to kind of set up the entire path from the source to the destination, from the caller to the callee. Set up the entire path, reserve resources at every intermediate switch where in the path, and then the voice call really starts. The content of the voice call really starts flowing. So this was completely opposite to that. Whenever you want to send a packet, you just shoot it out, and things work by magic. So at the higher layer, which did all the hard work, there were two protocols that were defined. UDP, which is the user datagram protocol. It was the most simplistic higher layer protocol required that was specified. Unreliable, didn't really put in a whole lot of thought into what needs to get done. It took packets as it came. It had mechanisms in place to make sure that whatever the underlying IP network provided, pretty much they just took it to the higher layer and created the higher layer datagram. And they did have some mechanisms to detect errors called the checksum. Again, that was optional. and if you did find an error, you didn't have much recourse because there was no major infrastructure put in place. So they just threw away that packet and then moved on. Okay, so they detected error, but they didn't really do any major error correction as such, and it did not have a mechanism to do any kind of congestion control or anything like that. There were certain applications which really benefited from it, predominantly applications like audio video, because they were these applications had the ability to withstand packet losses or out of sequence delivery, some packets getting missed, didn't really bother the applications a whole lot. So such applications were dependent on UDP. The other kind of application that depended on UDP were the very, very short transactional kind of applications like DNS. You just ask, give a host name, get the IP address back. That kind of a very short transaction kind of applications, again, relied on a UDP protocol. But the more sophisticated protocol at that point in time was TCP, which guaranteed a reliable network connection between the two end hosts on top of a unreliable network layer infrastructure. Okay? So the underlying network was absolutely unreliable, so we would have packets coming out of order and all that. So TCP kind of provided the what they call as a connection-oriented kind of a look and feel for higher layer applications. So the higher layer application that leveraged TCP did not have to worry about will my packet reach the end host, will it reach in order, will it be reliably delivered, all those kinds of things. The underlying network would take care of, TCP would take care of it. Application did not have to worry about those kinds of logic, but the TCP layer had to do all these kinds of things to take care of, how to provide an ordered stream, how to provide, congestion control and flow control and so on. Okay. To be able to do that, it maintained a state at both the end hosts. Again, I'm saying this, the state was maintained only at the end host, not in the network, and the state was used to kind of keep track and provide this kind of a service to the higher layers. So they had sequence numbers to take care of sequencing or ordering. They had window size to take care of congestion and flow control, and so on and so forth. Obviously, TCP, though it was a protocol defined in, it is a very early RFC defined in '83, over a period of time when it got implemented, there were a lot of changes that happened. So it has evolved over a period of time from the very first '82 when the first RFC came out. It has gone through many changes. Again, as and when they started rolling out TCP in the network, they figured out certain things were not working. For example, the congestion control algorithm that was originally proposed did not make sense. It did still lead to a whole lot of congestion. There were a lot of, or the throughput diminished to a very large extent. So they figured out fixes to this. But by and large, the principle that was used to set up TCP and principle that was used at IP continued for the next 20 years. Okay. So this is the early stage work that was done for the first 20 years, the birth of the internet. What I'll do now is take a quick pause, open up the floor for any questions either here or in remote locations, take a 2-minute pause, and then we'll start with the second part of the second phase of the internet. So are the bridges open? Any questions here in Pune first? Yes.
In your slide for circuit switching, I have read about circuit switching. There was a part of the digital PBX.
Yes.
I want to know about that. I don't know what is the digital thing doing in that analog type of communication.
So when I said circuit switch is not analog, it doesn't mean analog. Circuit switch does not mean analog. Circuit switch, you could still have a digital connection, and you could have a digitized way of transmitting information. Digital and analog is only the way in which you transmit the information. It had nothing to do with the philosophy of how the connection got set up. Okay?
So what does the PBX do?
So the PBX is basically the end host that kind of routes the final, that's the final hop of the call, the phone call, comes to the PBX and then gets routed to the final phone. So it is a switch. Sure. Any other questions here? There are no questions in Pune. Let me take Nagpur. Any questions in Nagpur? So no questions in Nagpur. No questions from Nagpur. Any questions from Aurangabad or Nashik? I presume there are no questions there. Any questions from Goa or Hyderabad? Any questions in Belgaum? There are 2 colleges there. No questions. All right. So if there are no questions, let me move on. You could please mute the line again, please. So let me move to the second phase of the internet, what we call as the Internet 2.0, where internet really goes commercial. So what were the events that really led to internet going commercial? So a few things. One is this whole, like I said, Tim Berners-Lee came up with this World Wide Web protocol, the idea there, and then Netscape launched the first browser, and then people started getting a feel of, how content could be made available through with hyperlinks and hypertext and so on. So we all know what a web is. I don't need to describe that. The second thing that happened was that commercial internet service providers started coming up. They started offering dial-up services for regular consumers, users to access the internet. Okay? So AOL and others started coming up with providing ISP dial-up services. Okay? The moment they started doing that, obviously they were charging for that service, so there was a whole commercial angle coming in, and the backbone also started getting evolved to from being just provided by a research community funded by DARPAs and the ARPAs of the world to more of telecom operators getting into the infrastructure. So the AT&Ts, the MCIs, the Sprints, and all the others started getting into providing internet as a backbone service. So there was the ISP who provided dial-up, and then there was the backup for the backbone, which provided the data connectivity, and that's how the web started. The commercialized version of the web started. Okay. The other thing was that technology started improving so much that bandwidth was doubling. The bandwidth capacity was doubling every 6 months, and this was much faster than the processing capability. Processing capability, as per Moore's law, was only every 18 months, while the bandwidth was really doubling every 6 months. And once people started getting a hang of this whole internet, they started pushing lots of different applications on top of it. So like I said, the IP was designed to be application agnostic, right? So they didn't care about what application went on top of it. So people started using it for audio, pictures, video, and so on and so forth, though in a very not as high definition as today, definitely to some extent low quality, but at least the application started getting deployed and people started using it. And as with the use of each application, the requirement for the bandwidth also kind of increased similarly. And the operators, since the same telecom operators who were operating the voice network also got into the same space of offering for data services as well, they figured out that managing 2 networks was becoming a nightmare. So they wanted to slowly start unifying at least the infrastructure into one single unified network. So all these were kind of things that were happening in the late 80s to early 90s, and that really led to the whole growth of the internet in the mid 90s and beyond. So some of the observations was that what I said, which is broadband access started happening. People started using the broadband access for high bandwidth intensive applications like audio and video and so on. So these two kind of kept fueling each other. So you provide broadband access, you consume more of it. Because you consume more of it, more need to be provided. Once more need got provided, people started using it even more, and so on and so forth. So it was like a nice, two supporting, services kind of supporting each other. Okay. Once the application started demanding more, new applications came in like VoIP and others, and people started realizing that this one size network, which is one data network, did not really work. So you needed 2 networks, but they could not afford to support 2 networks. So they said, let's start unifying it. Okay, and this whole dumb network model people started questioning it. Now, if the network is dumb, it does not know the difference between an email application and a voice application. How can it service both these applications well? One of them had to suffer, right? If you don't know what it is, then you have to at least, you will treat the voice and the email application similarly. Obviously, it's going to have a problem, right? So they started questioning, does network have to be really dumb? So some slides on what kind of growth. If you can see, mid 95 onwards is where the number of domains and the number of networks started really growing exponentially. And this is the number of hosts, that is the end systems. Again, mid-90s onwards, it really started scaling up. And these were the kind of applications that started getting deployed on the networks. So if you look at typical applications, right, there are actually three parameters on which the quality of the application is dependent on. One is the latency or the delay, or sensitivity to delay. Okay, so if you have low sensitivity to delay, that means you need really low. You cannot. If you have high sensitivity to delay, you need a very low latency kind of a service. Okay, very quick, rapid response. Okay, and then there are the bandwidth, which is low to high. So if you take a typical text email, it had a very low requirement on both the bandwidth as well as not very sensitive to delays. You could pretty much take additional extra few minutes, few seconds. It didn't really matter. On the other end of the spectrum was an interactive video conferencing kind of an application, very sensitive to both the delay as well as very high bandwidth consuming. And the third axis, which I have not shown here, is the loss, is the third angle or the third axis on which the application is dependent on. So certain applications were tolerant of loss in the sense that they could, it doesn't matter whether if some packets got lost, while certain applications like email and e-commerce kind of applications could not tolerate the loss. I mean, you cannot have a packet loss in the network. Okay, so these are the three axes on which typical applications were defined, and they kind of defined how the kind of services that they expected from the network to support these applications. So a high latency sensitive application expected the network to really give them very quick response. Those packets needed to be processed extremely fast through the network. Okay. Similarly, the high bandwidth required a very large pipe to push all the content out into the network, push it from one end to the other at the as much as possible at the fastest rate possible. Okay. So if you're now thinking of all these various kinds of applications to be supported on one single infrastructure, they started talking about what is called as a next generation network. The next generation is in the 90s. So what we have today is the rolled out NGN, and they started talking about what is this one single network that can handle all these kinds of different kind of requirements from voice applications, video applications, data applications, and so on. Since they were very familiar for the first 20 years with packet switched, they didn't really want to change a whole lot on the packet switched infrastructure. They said, let's just continue with that. And finally, they wanted to obviously have a lot of controls on providing a quality of service in the internet, which was previously providing only best effort. They wanted to have a quality control in the network to provide these kinds of quality, okay, to support these applications. And because people were used to the telephone call, which was supposed to be the highest quality in voice, they wanted the internet to provide voice quality which was in the same level as the quality of the PSTN voice. Okay. Now, when all this was happening, there were two kind of ideologies that came up. One was what we call as the bellhead ideology, and the other was the nethead ideology. We'll talk a little bit about what these are. So what the bellheads were doing was they came from the telephone companies, right? The AT&T Bells and all these guys, right? All the Bells and the children of Bell and so on, right? They came from a circuit switch telco background. So what was the philosophy of a circuit switch telco background? The philosophy was all the intelligence is in the network, the end terminals are dumb, right? How dumb is your telephone, or how smart is your telephone? Doesn't do anything but have 12 digits, right? And you punch those, nothing much beyond that. All the intelligence of call routing, everything happens in the network. So they believed in that philosophy that the network has to have all the intelligence in this unified NGN. Okay, that was their approach. On the other hand, the nethead said, well, we are used to this IP-based infrastructure where the network is dumb, but the end use hosts are smart. So we believe that the NGN should have the same philosophy. Okay, the bellheads, because they were part of ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, and all that, so they wanted whatever standardization came about as part of ITU. These guys, the netheads, on the other hand, said, no, we will not do that. We will go with our IETF, which was the engineering task force, Internet Engineering Task Force. They said we will go with whatever IETF specifies. The bellheads were a closed community, netheads were open. They believed in guaranteed QoS because the telephone companies were always used to charging money for the services. Okay? And if you're charging money for the services, if you're, somebody is paying for the services, obviously there has to be some level of quality that the service provider has to guarantee. You cannot say, well, I'll take your application, I'll push it if I feel like it, but you still have to pay me, whatever, X. That model doesn't work. If you're taking X, you have to provide a service, and you have to provide some guarantees. Okay? So obviously, the netheads were not of the same philosophy. They said, no, the network should be best effort, and it should solve all the problems. And so the second part, which is, they expected to obviously get paid, the bellheads. The netheads said, no, we don't need to get paid. The internet has worked for 20 years. It will continue to work. Cheap, maybe. Free if possible, but cheap, at least not expensive. Okay? And the voice call was more of per minute charging, same philosophy as the circuit switched world, while these guys said it's just an application. So I don't see why it should be any more freer or any more charged than what you would typically charge an email. Right? So all these philosophies kind of started happening. Okay? Most important was that the bellheads wanted to control the network, because that's the only way they felt they could really monetize the service they were offering. Well, the nethead said no, there would be no control in the network, because they believed in this whole smart endpoint dumb network philosophy. So if you are in the telecom industry working in there during the mid-90s, any two people you meet, first question, or maybe at some point in time during a conversation you meet a stranger, first question would come up is, are you a nethead or a bellhead? Okay? Because that was like, there's no way you could be on the wall. You had to have an opinion, one way or another. Okay? And obviously these are completely differing ideologies, and it was really a fight many a times. Arguments would get very, very heated, but it was fun. So let me just give a brief thing of my own philosophy at that point in time. So I was working at that time for AT&T Bell Labs. So obviously with the word AT&T in it, it was obvious that I was, at that point in time, I was a PhD student. My research was sponsored by AT&T Bell Labs. So, obviously everybody in Bell Labs was Bellhead. So I had to kind of go with the same philosophy. Very, very ideological, very passionate, card-carrying member kind of a thing. But all that kind of changed around 1996. So let me talk a little bit about, what are the view of the bellheads at that point in time. So they came up with this whole concept of what is called as an ATM, which is an asynchronous transfer mode network. This was the view of their NG and how they would evolve it. They took the packet switch concept, but packets were of variable length. They said, variable length will not really help. And they said connectionless network cannot guarantee services. So they said it has to be connection oriented. So they set up a connection from one end to the other, had small cells, fixed size cells, packets which are called cells of 53 bytes each, 5 bytes header, 48 byte payload, and shipped it from one end to the other on a connection that was pre-established at the time of setting up the from the source to destination, any communication that need to be set up. So the path setup happened before any data transfer could happen. Okay? And then once the path was set up, obviously all cells went to the same path. So there was no need for reassigning, resequencing of cells and all that. All those issues went away. Okay? Very, very simplistic model. It was a direct extension from the circuit switch model that came into the connection-oriented world. Okay? And they had very stringent admission control policies, just like today. When you make a phone call, if the phone call cannot be completed, your phone call does not get accepted. There is no question of a low-quality phone call and a high-quality phone call, right? The phone call is accepted, the call goes through, you get the same quality irrespective of what it is. And same thing happened here. They put admission control. If your connection request went through, got admitted, you will get the quality that you asked for. If you don't get through, if the admission control policy, if you cannot service it, admission control policy will deny your connection. Okay? So they made very clear that they put all these controls in place, and they could achieve extremely high speeds of transfer. At that point in time, late 90s, mid 90s, to extent of 10 gigabit per second, which was unheard of at that point in time. Okay? And they had this whole vision of, there would be ATM in the core, and it will also reach all the way to the desktop. So they said Ethernet would die, IP would die, everybody would die, and ATM is the only protocol that will really survive. Okay, that was the philosophy. Okay. So this was a big challenge for the net heads now. So they had all this technology coming in, and they didn't know how to respond. What was the challenge? So if you look at the typical IP router, right, what does it do? When a packet comes in on an incoming link, it looks at the packet, looks at the IP header, and it has a routing table. It has an aggregated routing table. So it tries to figure out the longest prefix match, which is based on the IP address, figures out which is the most optimal route in which that packet could be forwarded. Correct? So it does all the processing of figuring out the longest prefix match, and then it does some manipulation on the header and pushes it out into the outgoing to the next router that it has to go to. Okay? Very simple exercise. But the problem was that it had to do this for every packet. So if you had a very long video call, for every packet that was in that video call, you had to do this exercise. Okay? So and it had to happen at every switch in the every router in the network. So if you're talking about these high speeds, how long did a router have to make all these decisions? So if you're talking about a speed of what is called as the OC12, is the optical connect 12 interface, which was 622 megabit per second, you had about 500 nanoseconds to make this decision. Okay, assuming 40 bytes packets and so on. On the other hand, if you had to go up to this 10 gigabit per second speed, which is what ATM was already supporting, you had to make this decision in 33 nanoseconds. No router at that point in time could really do this. Okay, so the future of for the net heads, the IP based philosophy was looking very, very bleak. The other thing was the routing table size as well. Okay, so that was one was how quickly to do this. The routing table size, because the number of hosts were increasing, the size of the routing table also increased exponentially. So from 89 to 2000, you can see the exponential increase of the routing table sizes. But the packet processing, unfortunately, because of all these limitations of longest prefix match and doing all that for every packet and so on, the throughput really could not grow at the same rate as the number of hosts. So the router performance, that is the number of packets it could really send through the router, was pretty much stagnated at that point in time. Okay. So they were all it was interesting to watch them kind of scratch their heads, figure out what to do and so on. So the debate started getting less heated because they were trying to kind of concede defeat, but short of raising the white flag, they got a breakthrough. So two things happened in 1996, which also kind of led to conversion of many of the bellheads into the nethead philosophy. The first thing that happened in 1996 was that AT&T split into three. Okay, so people who were working in Bell Labs, so AT&T went into one part of it was pure AT&T, which was the operator, the telephone and the data network provider. The second was Lucent, where the Bell Labs got aligned. The third was a company called NCR, which was doing all these NCR point of sales systems and so on. So people who were at Bell Labs and those places had no more affinity to support a bellhead philosophy. Okay, your hand that is feeding you is no longer, you can start biting it now because they are ultimately a customer. And Cisco and others are also equally there. So whoever is buying, you are selling to enterprises, you are selling to operators, whoever wanted whatever, we are ready to support. So you don't have to be now very, very ideological. When there is a customer in place, your ideology doesn't matter, right? So if you look at then the other key thing that happened was a company called Epsilon came up with the concept of IP switching. So what they did was, there were all these ATM switches getting deployed and so on and so forth, right? And it has its own protocol, it has everything on its own. They just took that hardware, put IP routing on top of it, and were able to switch packets at a phenomenal high rate based on the ATM lying underneath, the ATM switch lying underneath. So they differentiated between routing and switching as two separate functions. Okay. So here's what they did. They took a typical IP router is, you have your Ethernet layer or MAC layer software, hardware, you have your IP software. They have the ATM hardware was prevalent. They combined the two and put a middle layer, which is a flow management protocol, and put IP software on top of it. So what this achieved was, when a long flow happened, so when they decided, found that certain flows, which is a long connection belonging to a particular session, whatever, it could be a video call, audio call, or even a large email or a FTP transfer. once 5 packets of the same kind started coming in, they short circuited the routing entity and bypassed it and started doing ATM level switching. So now not every packet had to go through this whole philosophy of the whole flow of doing the longest prefix match, figuring out what to do with it and all that stuff. Okay? So this was the breakthrough that really gave a boost in the NetEdge arms and said, yeah, now we know how to do this, achieve higher speeds. And then they figured out that FTP, Telnet, they were all very flow oriented. 80% of the packets were short-lived, but doesn't have to be 80% of the packets were flow oriented, so you could do this bypass for 80%. Remaining 20% are short-lived, so they didn't worry too much on those fronts. Okay, so this is a kind of a statistic that they gathered and figured out that there are certain applications which were had lots of packets per flow. If you look at say FTP data, it's 525 packets per flow. If you look at TCP authentication, it's just 3. So they figured out all these kind of combinations. Said 80% of the packets anyway have flow oriented, so we can leverage this bypass mechanism. So once they did that bypass, then all the other companies, 96, everybody was just talking about IP switching. Cisco, Juniper, I don't know if Juniper, sorry, not Cisco, Juniper, Cisco, Cascade, whoever else was there, who all had ATM switches, they all started talking IP switching. And that's when Cisco came up with a Cisco tag switching. Again, same idea, but call it differently. IBM came up with a technology called Aries, same idea, slightly different. Toshiba came up with something called CSR, cell switch router. So they started calling it differently, but ultimately it was the same philosophy. Okay? And then in 96, late 96 and 97 came they kind of, all these guys got together and said, let's not all talk the same concept but differently. Let's put our heads together. That's the only way we can defeat the bellheads. They got together and defined what is called as MPLS, which is the multi-protocol label switching. Okay? So philosophy is the same. So what they did was, first of all, they broke the IP TCP stack, the network layer and the MAC layer, the layer 2 data link layer. They kind of broke that a little bit. They inserted a layer in between, which is considered as layer 2.5. It's not layer 2, it's not layer 3, it's something in between, and put this MPLS in between. And the philosophy that they used was, you do routing at the edge and forwarding in the core. Okay? I'll talk a little bit about what it means. So they created predefined paths and then used the MPLS header to actually switch the packets in through major chunks of the network. Only in certain edge points they did the actual routing, which is figuring out longest prefix path, longest prefix match, and so on and so forth. Okay? So this is what a typical IP packet looked like. You have your layer 2 header, the Ethernet header. You put an MPLS header in between, and it had fields to offer multiple levels of service as well. So you could have different paths for different kind of applications based on the MPLS header. Okay? So they took an IP packet, put this MPLS header into it, and where did they do this? So they said, okay, if this is the, let me go to the architecture there. Okay, here's what the typical MPLS domain looks like. So these are all the routers which are part of the MPLS domain. At the edges, you have what are called as LSRs, label switch routers. All these are edge routers or ingress and egress. Ingress is incoming, egress is outgoing. Okay? So at the ingress point, they did routing, figured out what the packet, where it has to go, and based on that, they put an MPLS header with a label, which is a fixed size header, and they set the path for this particular MPLS label. The path was predetermined through that particular domain. So the intermediate routers, the transit LSRs, did not have to do the prefix matching and all those kinds of things. They just switched based on the MPLS label. Okay? So that gave them the distinct advantage that they could quickly start moving these packets into these, across these large MPLS domains. And as you start increasing the size of the domain, your packets start flowing much faster. Okay? And this technology was so powerful. Of course, each LSR is also an IP router, so it could do IP routing if required, but for most packets it did not need to. Okay? So they created what are called as forwarding equivalence classes. That is, when a packet comes in, you make a decision which egress router this packet needs to go to and which path it should follow. So that decision was made at the ingress LSR here. the left side. Okay. Once the path was decided, all the traffic would go on that particular path. So as an example here, there are two kinds of traffic, both need to go to the same egress LSR. So one intended for in this cloud here, one is a Paris network, another for Rome network. The Paris network takes the green path because that is the decision that is made at the ingress layer, the ingress switch, and the Rome traffic takes the blue path. So you can now differentiate, though they meant for the same egress router, you can decide two different paths for the same similar kind of traffic. And that decision can be made based on the kind of application, kind of service that the person is willing to pay for, all those kinds of things. Okay? That intelligence was put at the ingress layer to make those calls. The intermediate routers, the LSRs, did not have any role to play. They just switched based on the labels coming in. Clear? So this technology now has evolved. This happened in mid-97 and then has evolved into now pretty much most of the traffic today, backbone traffic, goes on somewhere or the other would touch an MPLS domain somewhere, get routed really fast, switched really fast, and routed only at selective places. So typical decision point, if you didn't have MPLS, you would look at every header, examine IP header at everything, every intermediate place. Now you are only examining IP header only at the ingress and the egress place. Clear? All right. So this kind of led to the whole speeding up of the net heads. Yeah, just one second. So this led to the speeding up of the net for the net heads, and this was really the shot in the arm. So this happened in 96. The AT&T split happened in 96. So a lot of bell heads at that point in time started getting converted to the net head philosophy, and that has kind of remained. So if you see today's unified network, a lot of it is IP based, most of it happening at some point or the other, touching an MPLS domain at some point or the other in its journey from one end to the other. Yeah, this question.
So does this mean that the ingress LSR and the egress LSR have to be much more powerful machines?
Yes, the ingress and egress LSR have to be much more powerful machines, but the intermediate ones don't have to be. It's not more of the power, it is more of the amount of time that they spend on a packet. I mean, that is more important. Power could be, because hardware capability you can start pumping a lot more, but it's the time that is spent on the packet which is more critical. Because if you have to do the same thing again and again, if you are going through 10 hops and 10 hops are doing identical things, you are just wasting time. Here you are wasting time only in the two ends, not in between, and that helped get the throughput. And because you are not doing prefix match, you could do the implementation of label switching can happen in hardware. That gives a quick boost to the switching as well. Okay? Yeah.
So you were talking about if a packet is coming from, if a number of packets are coming from the same source.
Yes.
The delay was happening because for each packet we were doing checking the routes and everything. So why didn't they do caching over there? Like if the packet header is similar to the previous packet header,
yes,
they could just use the information that was used to route the previous packet header and transport it.
Correct.
Without the processing delay.
Correct.
So was this idea ever implemented, thought about?
It was obviously thought about. There was caching, but then you could do only caching to a certain extent. You could not really do a whole lot of caching. Having said that, even caching, right, you could not see, it's very difficult to figure out what the next packet would be. It could have similar looking header, but you would not be able to say that these two belong to the same flow. That flow detection was the challenge. You could cache it, but you couldn't do the flow detection. That's where the challenge was. Being able to do that, again, question was not about able to do it. You could do it, but it took time. Now you're just allowing only the ingress and the egress routers to do the same thing and then figuring out, where to go, where the packet has to go. You had a question, Ajay?
On the ingress LSR, now we are taking all routing decisions at that. How does it know about the information about the entire network? And what if some network? So how does the ingress LSR knows about the network topology? What if it is changing? That's what.
So this is for a domain. So it is not the entire internet is not an MPLS domain. It is for a small set of set of routers or switches in a particular domain. Okay? So and there were multiple paths and redundant paths even in that. So when we talked about MPLS, I talked a very simple case of path being set up. There were mechanisms in place to have primary path, backup path, and all those kinds of things. So in case any one of the LSRs in the middle kind of were to go down, immediately it would switch to an alternate path and so on. So there were mechanisms put in place for all that.
Okay, so MPLS also has standards about how to percolate this.
Correct.
Flow
so there were protocols defined to percolate the labels and set all that up. So what are the routing protocols? A parallel protocol called LDP, this is label distribution protocol, got defined, and that helps in setting up some of these labels. And even those LDPs have now evolved where people say we don't need to have a protocol, we just fix these routes. I mean, ultimately, you have a small domain, you're going to have only these 5 paths. So why don't you have a primary and secondary path and tertiary path already predefined?
Okay.
So you don't need to do a whole lot of exercise there also.
Thanks. Yeah.
Any other questions here in Pune? So let me do that. I have some examples. I don't need to go there. So let me just summarize the MPLS thing and then move on to the third part. So as I said, MPLS forwarding was much more time effective in terms of the amount of time it took, and because it had a fixed size header, and that could be implemented in hardware rather than software typical that was what would happen in an IP switching IP routing. So that was one that led to speed up. The second was this whole decision making point was restricted to only certain nodes and not the entire network, brought about a lot of speed up. So today most service providers are therefore offering MPLS, and then MPLS has also evolved from what it was before in 97 to over last 10-12 years. A lot of things have happened, but predominantly the philosophy has not changed. Okay, so let me take a pause here and open up the floor for questions. I've had questions in Pune. Let me just ask for questions in other locations. Rashmi, is the bridge open? Nobody has any questions? Good. All right, so let me go to the third section, which is, so this is where we are, and let's now use this section to talk on where we are headed. Now, what I'm going to talk about is going to be obviously futuristic, so don't put a gun to my head if things don't materialize the way I'm presenting here. These are all research, but good thing is, for students who are here and for people who are focusing on research, there will be a lot of good topics in this. That could be your BTech projects, MTech projects, PhD thesis, whatever. Okay. So what are the challenges today? So we talked about, wow, MPLS did this, blah, 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 all that nice, good things have happened. One of the things that TCP has not addressed very effectively is support for mobility. And today, if you know, mobile devices are the ones that are really consuming all the network traffic. They are using a lot of network traffic, but the protocol as such is not very well defined for, or not very efficient for mobility. Okay? Why? Because as you keep moving around, you change your base station, you change a lot of things. You typically today it's a band-aid application that's put on top of it. You have proxies and so on, but it doesn't really give you all the benefit. Okay? So inefficient implementation. The moment the internet got opened up to consumers and everybody and anybody in the world, people started using the same internet for malicious intent. So viruses, spams, bots, denial of service attacks, all that, hacking, everything started coming into the network. When it was a research community, ultimately it was only a few bunch of academics and research scientists who were using it. They didn't really harm anyone. They were very benign people. But the regular consumers are not. So they started hacking into things. And then, of course, when there is a lot of commerce happening on the internet, there is also a lot of ROI if you do hacking, right? If you can hack into, somebody's password and internet banking passwords and so on, you can do a lot of it. It's very, very lucrative. So there are a lot of these things also happen. And internet was not designed. It was always designed with friendly, nice, people in mind. Okay. The third thing is multi-homing. Multi-homing is basically, today if you have internet connectivity, you have one operator or one service provider providing you connectivity. Obviously, if that one service provider goes down or doesn't offer a service, you don't have a way to switch operators. Okay? And multi-homing, the problem is if there is an ongoing connection, that connection has to be broken. You switch to the other operator, and then the connection has to be re-established. Again, there are technologies available to take care of this a little seamlessly, but predominantly that needs to happen in some form or the other. Okay? And overall the TCP was designed with assuming that network would be mostly connected. There would be spots that would not be, but you will always have a workaround. There will always be alternate paths and other things available, but which is not true for some of the newer technologies coming up. Okay? And the whole TCP IP is all very network centric. They didn't have people in mind, right? They were only saying, okay, what is your IP address? That is your identity, right? Even today, right? When you go and you're logged, if your something is logged, if you make a request and you have to be logged, the log says this request came from IP address, whatever, 100.200.300 or whatever. No, not 300, sorry. But so it is very, very host centric. It is not people centric. And today people are the ones who are using the net, right? So you have your laptop, you have your desktop, you have your phone, you have your tablet, you have your what have you, and all these are network connected and they are all people based. They are not machine based. So when you are using an email, it is you who are using an email, not the machine. So if you are checking your mail on your desktop and checking your mail on your laptop or your tablet, it should be, it should know who you are. The network should know. Today it doesn't. It just goes by IP address, says, oh, this is IP address 100, whatever, this is IP address 200, so they are two different entities. It doesn't really do that kind of smartness. Okay? And there is no centricity around content. Ultimately, what are you accessing? You are accessing a video, you are accessing some audio files, you are accessing pictures, you are accessing Facebook, you are accessing Twitter, whatever. These are all applications and they are all content rich, but the network is not really very smart in that. Okay? It's again, by design, a decision that was made whatever 40 years back that network should be dumb has continued, but overall that is also leading to some of the challenges today. Okay? So three areas of research, again the first two are kind of what, the reason I picked those two was more of from what, from the topic of today, theme of today, which is work of Vint and Cerf. So Vint Cerf has been kind of focusing on these two areas. So I will spend some time talking about it, and then the third area is something that is really, I believe, something which definitely thrive. It's just a matter of time, so we need to really explore that. Again, I'm not going to go into very much detail about any of these topics. These are futuristic, a lot of papers available, very early stage, but definitely if you are interested, we can talk and you can go and read up on many of these areas. So what's a delay tolerant network? A delay tolerant is what I said before, right? So TCP is kind of designed for networks where most of the components of the network are connected and end-to-end delays are reasonable within few hundred milliseconds. Anything beyond few hundred milliseconds, you start getting timeouts, blah, 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 all that stuff. It's not been designed for this, right? So compared to that, you start looking at a different way of looking at the network. So a delay tolerant network is kind of characterized by few main characteristics, which is not internet. One is that the connectivity is intermittent. You don't always have full connectivity on the network. And where are these kinds of scenarios? The scenarios happen many a times, right? If you're talking about, let's say, sensor networks, right? You have your home refrigerators, your tube lights and everything talking to each other. Now, do they want to be on the network all the time? What are they really going to do? They're not checking Twitter, right? They're not going into Facebook. You want to use your fridge to, or whatever, when you want to talk to the fridge, not talk to the fridge, when you want to connect to the fridge, find out something, it's only during a specific time of the day for a very specific activity transaction. Why should the fridge be on the network all the time, right? And then there are networks in certain remote parts of the world where you don't have connectivity, you don't have physical connectivity. So there would always be some way in which you can address some intermittent connectivity. A very good example is in Africa. So there they have these villages, small villages, separated by several 50, 100 kilometers away, and they have, they have provided network connectivity. They don't have power to support a satellite transmission and all that stuff. So what they've done is very fun, very interesting. So they have a bus which provides a wireless LAN access point, and when the bus reaches your home or your village, you have connectivity at that point in time. You go around, go to the next village, the first village gets disconnected, second village gets connected, and so on and so forth. So it's like old days, there used to be these mail drops, right? Once during the day, 12 p.m., the mail van comes in, you get your letters, goes to the next village, drops the mail in that village and goes back and so on. So the same philosophy kind of has been adopted here and very, very cost effective. So now you don't have to worry about providing power for very high transmissions and other things. Just wait for the bus. When the bus comes, you get access, finish your work, move on. And technologies and protocols need to be designed for that kind of a network. Okay. So there are certain, so basic paradigm is store and forward message switching. So you kind of, whatever you want to, information you want to transfer, you just transfer to the next entity, store there, move to the next, and so on and so forth. So the question is, email does the same thing, right? So what is different? Email does it, but email today does not have a mechanism in which to say that, okay, fine, if the message does not reach the end, what corrective actions do I take? Right? I can try resending it after 2 hours, 3 hours. If I don't reach the end point, it just sends you back saying, message undelivered. That's it. What am I supposed to do with it if I get a message undelivered? I can't do anything. So you have to provide a reliable mechanism. You cannot say that, I'll wait for the bus, I send the message, the next time the bus comes around, I get a message saying message undelivered. What do? I wasted 24 hours, the message has not reached, right? So you have to have a very reliable way of transmitting information. Okay? So this is a kind of an architecture they have said. Obviously, they don't want to, completely unroot whatever is there, the internet and other things. They have built an overlay on top of the existing infrastructure and called it a delay tolerant network. It's an overlay. So they have these pockets of network which are very well connected, which have different characteristics. Looks very, very similar to 1970 when there were all these packet networks connected by the internet gateways, right? It's along the same lines. You put these DTN or the delay tolerant network gateways, and that is the entity that will store this information for as much time as needed till the information gets delivered. Okay? And it provides a reliable mechanism in which if information is not delivered, keep trying, provide you in alternate mechanisms. They have defined all the protocols. I won't go into all the details now. I am running out of time, so I'll just quickly brush through this. That's what it is. Ultimately, you push, you have a way to identify each of these content. There are identifiers, unique identifiers available, and these identifiers have a label associated with it, and you can search for that information. You can ask for that information using that label. Okay? So they have defined all kinds of infrastructural support needed. One is at the network layer, security layer, and all the other, the naming conventions. All that has been very well defined to support this kind of an infrastructure. The other growth is the content-centric network. So just want to contrast with the, the hourglass that we saw with the IP, right? The thin, narrow waist of IP. So that is what the traditional internet looks like. And slowly we are finding that ultimately what we are accessing on the network are chunks of content, right? Be it video, be it audio, be it whatever. So what is a chunk of content? It's not an entire movie. So if it's a 3-hour movie, you're not asking for the entire 3-hour movie. The network or the requester asks for, give me the first 5 minutes. Once the first 5 minutes plays, give me the next 5 minutes, and so on and so forth, right? So you have these chunks of content residing in the network, in some location somewhere, content store somewhere, and that is what you are asking for. Be it movie, be it web, whatever it is. Ultimately, that is what is defining the applications that we use. It could be even your Twitter and Facebook. Ultimately, it's all content, right? So that's what you're accessing. So why not have a content-centric network and define protocols around it to access this content easily and get, deliver that content easily as well. So the underlying infrastructure, the IP, UDP, P2P, BCAS, all that layer has now pushed way low into the network, assuming that that will happen very, very efficiently, and that mechanisms are in place. So two things they are defined. One is called as a strategy and the security. So the strategy kind of defines how a content will be delivered to the requester. What is the best way to do it? So you have multiple channels today. You could get the content through the 3G infrastructure, 4G infrastructure, wireless infrastructure, or the wired infrastructure, or whatever. There are multiple mechanisms by which you can get the information. Let the delivery part of the network take care of it, but the requester and the applications and all these that are designed will only ask for content. Okay? And the second part is security, because you don't, when you ask for content, the content will be protected, because not all content is accessible to all. You will have to put in digital rights management, you have to put in some security, authorized access to that content, all that. You don't want your Facebook ID to be available to all, right? So you put some authorization around it and define the whole security framework around that. Okay? But once that is done, The request comes in the form of an interest packet. So you ask for it. Interest is, I am interested in this content. And then there is a data packet that responds back saying, I can deliver this content, and so on and so forth. The infrastructure has been defined. Okay. And the third one, again, lot of challenges. It's not fully defined yet, but a lot of good things have happened. I'm sorry, I'm brushing past these things just because of time. But if there are questions, I'll be more than happy to address them. The third one is the concept of a software-defined network. So we talked about this whole routers and other things, right? People ask the question, is router, the ingress LSR, very, very powerful, right? Yes. And the moment it is powerful, it is also very expensive, complex, and so on. Ultimately, you said, why do you need all that? Let, some of these ideas of, let this path being set up in the middle of an MPLS and all that, some of these ideas percolated and said, let the entire network infrastructure be just doing one simple thing, which is packet forwarding, and let it be in a hardware. The routes that are needed and all that, let the intelligence of all that remain in a centralized controller to take care of all this. Okay? So rather than the routers finding who are my neighbors and finding the best path and all that kind of thing, you have a central entity that pushes this information to the routers, and the router does only one thing, which is the packet comes in, forwards it to the next router, and so on. Okay? So this is the whole idea of software-defined network. So they have defined, there is an open protocol called OpenFlow, it's just one of them. Most network equipment vendors, Cisco, Juniper, Ericsson, Lucent, all these are part of the OpenFlow consortium. They all have an OpenFlow agent running on their hardware, which can receive these instructions from an OpenFlow controller, which is in a central location, pushing all the forwarding information to these routers, and then the actual routing happens on the routing decisions or forwarding happens on the router layer. Okay? Make sense? And these controllers, they have their own operating system, and you define applications assuming that this kind of an application, this kind of infrastructure is available. Okay? So your applications really don't change. So if you look at it, there is also this whole concept of virtualization, network virtualization coming in. So in the computer industry, virtualization is now very common, right? VMware and Hyper-V and all these virtualization technologies today exist, right? So what they do is basically take the hardware, you create an abstraction layer, virtualized abstraction layer, and then you write your OS and other things on top of that abstraction. That's why you can run multiple OSs on top of that abstraction layer, right? You can run Windows and Linux and other OSs in parallel concurrently. Same kind of philosophy goes into the network. Now you have this networking infrastructure, start virtualizing it to a virtualization layer, and that gives you a significant power in terms of what all you can do. So you can virtualize the bandwidth, you can virtualize the topology, you can virtualize the CPU, of course, that resides on the hardware. You can virtualize the traffic, basically isolate different kinds of traffic, and you can pretty much virtualize anything that is there on the router today, right? And by providing that, you can create slices of network that only you, as in set of users, can see. Okay? But they all share the same physical hardware infrastructure. So that's the whole power of virtualization, and that's something that is happening. Again, very new, but a lot of recent acquisitions. There used to be a company called Nicira, which was developing this network virtualization solution, got acquired by VMware a couple of months back for a huge amount, 1.2 billion or something. There was another company called Exigo doing similar thing, got acquired by Oracle recently. So, a lot of activity happening in this space, definitely something to watch out for. Again, not all problems have been solved, but definitely something that will get solved in the coming years, something to look forward to, that will change the whole way in which we look at networks. Okay? So this is how the network would look like, and let me just throw the last slide. Though we talked about internet, packet switching, control, no control in the network and all that stuff, eventually it looks like we are going back to do you know what this is? This is the old telephone switching network, where the control was in one central location, and the network was just doing one thing, which was switching of voice content, So pretty much a little bit of revival of what the old architecture is. Again, this is just a comment we made very cheekily, but definitely the power of having that centralized control is going to be enormous. Different kinds of applications can definitely happen there. So with this, I'll just stop and open up the floor again for questions. The bridge is open. Any questions here? Yes.
So with the scaling of the database, like maybe the being washed over the internet, can there be a smartness introduced in the network itself? So let's say a category of people are watching the same movie from Netflix. And now, right now, it's maybe the Netflix which might be doing the more of a work where it has to decide, okay, this particular area will be serviced by that server of theirs. But can the network do that smartness?
So that's why when you talked about that content-centric network, that's exactly what it is. That now the intelligence comes into the network. So basically, people are questioning the paradigm of dumb networks, intelligent hand hosts. Is that really adding any value? Does it support the applications of the future? Again, time will tell, but today that's the thought process. They are trying to now revive this, but the internet is so well spread out that it's going to be very difficult to do a complete revamp. So all these things will happen in pockets, in overlays, and over a period of time, if they are popular and become more efficient, things will get percolated into the mainstream networks. But definitely that's happening.
I have is about the internet being made available in the aerospace or the planes.
Yes.
How that would impact the network
So today the way the network is available in the planes is because over land, it doesn't happen over the sea. There are base stations in the, on the ground. The plane has a very powerful transmitter that kind of pushes the content to the base stations on the ground and gets information back. So today that's how it has been designed. But if you look at the other thing that I was talking about, is the delay tolerant network, you wouldn't go into that. Your protocols have been defined, need to be defined, which can now store and forward. So when you have to send a mail or send a content, it gets stored. When the plane lands at a particular destination, then the content gets pushed out. So, but your functionality remains pretty much the same. You may not get most up-to-date updates and other things, but definitely something that we can look at. Again, it's not something that is mainstream yet. These are research areas. A lot of challenges still exist. We need to solve those before it becomes mainstream.
Thank you.
Any other question? Yes.
We talked of SDN, software-defined network.
Yes.
We also have cognitive radio networks.
Yes.
So is it that overlap is just related to the way things are controlled?
Yeah.
Or
so
we have cognitive radio which will be wireless by way of satellite?
Correct.
Or the way the decision is made
right.
about
So there is software-defined radio as well. So it's a question about what layer we are talking about. So what network virtualization, if you look at virtualization, right, it has been there at the layer 2, the data link layer through VLANs and other things. It has been there at layer 3 through VPNs and so on. So the technology is not new. What this provides is a unified way of looking at all layers of the network and virtualizing all layers of the network in a unified framework. So all these components will definitely be part of the software-defined network layer. Yes.
So I'm just curious with all these changes, and I mean maybe we might come back one full circle as well. But how do the current mainstream telecom networks work? Whether it's wireless or wireline,
yes.
Are they really using internally any of the packet switching or VoIP, or
yes.
internally still using the old format?
No.
Dedicated
most of them today have their backbone has moved to IP. That's what I was saying, right? See, in the last 20 years, most of the backbones of operators have moved to IP-based infrastructure. Some components have been would be MPLS, some would not, depending on how forward-looking the operator has been. But definitely, it's all moved to packet switching. There is still, of course, given the legacy of circuit switch network, there is still a lot of circuit switching, but that only happens at the last mile. Yes.
I mean, you might still have a router exchange.
Possible, yeah. Some village might still have it, but the most of the backend, where the trunks are carried, most of them are today on an IP network. Any other questions here? All right, if there are no questions here, let me quickly go around to Nagpur. Any questions? No questions in anywhere else? All right. So thank you for listening. It's been a pleasure. We'll take a quick break for about 15 minutes, get back at 3:45 for the next session. We'll talk about net neutrality.